Before we begin today's episode, we want to remind listeners that the conversations on data and dissonance are meant to encourage discussion, debate, and critical thinking. The views expressed by the host and panelists are their own and may not reflect the opinions of every listener, and that's okay. Our goal is not to tell people what to think, but to explore complex cultural, political, and societal topics from multiple perspectives. Some of the subjects we discuss may challenge assumptions or spark disagreement, but we believe respectful conversation is still one of the most important ways people can better understand the world around them.
If you listen to enough conversations about younger generations today, you'll hear the same phrases over and over again. Kids today are too sensitive. Nobody can handle criticism anymore. Everyone gets a participation trophy. Somewhere along the way, the idea took hold that modern culture has become softer, more protective, maybe even a little fragile. But at the same time, today's younger generations are growing up in a world that looks nothing like the one their parents grew up in. Social media means every mistake can be broadcast to the entire internet. The pressure to succeed academically and professionally is intense. Housing costs are higher, competition is fierce, and the pace of change in technology and society is faster than ever before. So maybe the real question isn't whether this generation is fragile. Maybe the question is what kind of environment we've created for them to grow up in. Are we raising a generation that's less resilient than the ones before it? Or are we asking them to navigate a world that's more complicated, more competitive, and more psychologically demanding than any generation has faced before? That's what we're diving into tonight. Are we raising a more fragile generation? Let's bring in the panel. Joining me tonight is the crew that helps break down the chaos every week. Brian is here, bringing the MAGA fire and the belief that America still thrives when people embrace responsibility, toughness, and the kind of resilience that built the country in the first place. Rachel joins us as always, our independent voice who tends to step back from the cultural noise and ask whether the systems shaping society are actually helping people or making life harder than it needs to be. Daniel is with us as well, connecting the dots behind the headlines and looking at the deeper forces shaping cultural trends, technology, and the way society evolves over time. And Skylar rounds out the panel tonight, bringing a progressive perspective focused on social realities, economic pressure, and how modern systems affect the way younger generations experience the world. And as always, I'm Artie, somewhere in the middle of the conversation, trying to keep things honest while we dig into the bigger questions. Tonight's question might sound simple on the surface, but it gets complicated pretty fast. Are we raising a more fragile generation? Or are younger Americans simply growing up in a world that's fundamentally different from the one their parents knew? Let's get into it. Every generation eventually gets compared to the one before it. You hear older generations say things like, "We had it harder," or "Kids today wouldn't survive what we went through." And sometimes those comparisons are exaggerated, and nostalgia has a way of making the past seem tougher and simpler at the same time. But there are some cultural shifts that are hard to ignore. Parenting styles have changed. Schools approach discipline and competition differently. Mental health conversations are more common. Social media has introduced a level of social pressure and public scrutiny that previous generations never experienced. So the debate has become pretty common in American culture. Some people argue that modern society is becoming too protective, that shielding young people from hardship might actually make it harder for them to develop resilience. Others argue the opposite, that today's challenges are simply different, and younger generations are adapting to pressures previous generations never faced. Brian, let me start with you. When you look at the way kids and young adults are being raised today compared to 20 or 30 years ago, do you think society has become too protective and created a more fragile generation? Or do you think people are exaggerating the problem and overlooking the realities younger Americans are actually dealing with today?
Look, I know this topic can rub people the wrong way, but I think there's a lot of truth to the idea that society has become more protective than it used to be. And sometimes that protection comes at the cost of resilience. If you go back a few decades, kids had a lot more freedom and a lot more responsibility earlier in life. People got part-time jobs younger, they were expected to figure things out on their own, and failure was just part of the process. Nobody expected life to be perfectly fair, and learning how to deal with setbacks was something most people went through growing up. Today, in many cases, it feels like the culture tries to remove every obstacle and every uncomfortable moment. And while that might come from a good place, it can also leave people less prepared for the real world. I also think social media has changed the way younger generations experience life in a huge way. When we were growing up, if you embarrassed yourself or made a mistake, Maybe a few people saw it and then everyone moved on. Today, a bad moment can follow someone around online forever. At the same time, young people are constantly comparing themselves to influencers and celebrities online who are presenting a perfect version of life that isn't realistic. That combination creates a lot of pressure and anxiety, and it can make normal challenges feel overwhelming. So when people talk about fragility, I don't necessarily think it's because young people are weaker. I think it's because the culture around them sometimes discourages the kind of toughness and independence that previous generations had to develop naturally.
Brian, I think you touched on something there that a lot of people from older generations recognize. The idea that struggle used to be part of growing up. Whether it was working your first job, dealing with criticism, losing a game, or just figuring things out without a safety net, those experiences were often where people built confidence and resilience. At the same time, though, it's also fair to say the environment today is very different. Social media alone has added a layer of pressure that previous generations never had to navigate, where every mistake or awkward moment can live online forever. And that's where this conversation gets interesting because there's a fine line between preparing people for the real world and protecting them from things that could genuinely harm their development. Mental health awareness, for example, is something society talks about far more openly now than it did decades ago, and that's probably a good thing. But at the same time, some critics argue that in trying to make environments safer and more supportive, we may have accidentally reduced the amount of challenge that helps people build resilience. Rachel, let me bring you in here. When you look at the way parenting, education, and culture have shifted over the last couple of decades, do you think society has gone too far in trying to protect young people from hardship? Or do you think these changes are simply adapting to a world that's become more complex and demanding for younger generations?
I think the truth probably sits somewhere between those two ideas. There's definitely been a shift in how society approaches childhood and adolescence, and a lot of that came from good intentions. People became more aware of bullying, mental health struggles, and the long term impact that certain environments can have on kids. Schools and parents started trying to create spaces where young people felt safer speaking up, asking for help, and acknowledging when they were struggling. In many ways, that's a positive development because previous generations often had a tough it out mentality that sometimes ignored real emotional or psychological challenges people were dealing with. But I do think there's a risk when protection becomes the main goal instead of preparation. Life inevitably includes setbacks, criticism, failure, and uncomfortable situations. And learning how to navigate those experiences is a big part of developing confidence and independence. If young people grow up in environments where every obstacle is removed, or every uncomfortable moment is treated as something to avoid entirely, it can make the transition into adulthood much harder. Suddenly, they're entering workplaces, relationships, and real world responsibilities that don't operate under the same protective rules. And then there's the reality that younger generations are dealing with pressures that didn't exist in quite the same way before. Social media has changed social dynamics completely, academic expectations have increased, and the economic landscape is different enough that many young adults feel like the traditional milestones of adulthood. Buying a home, building financial stability, starting families are harder to reach. So I don't think it's fair to simply label younger generations as fragile. I think they're navigating a more complicated environment, and the real challenge for society is figuring out how to support them while still helping them build the resilience they'll need for the long run.
Rachel, that's a really good way to frame it because it highlights something that often gets lost in this debate: the difference between support and overprotection. Helping young people understand their emotions, deal with mental health challenges, and navigate a complicated world is clearly important. But at the same time, resilience usually comes from experience, and experience often includes struggle, failure, and learning how to recover from things not going your way. If every rough edge of life gets smoothed out too early, people may reach adulthood without ever having built those muscles. And I think another layer to this conversation is how rapidly the cultural environment has changed. The last 20 years didn't just bring new parenting styles or new education approaches, they brought a completely different digital landscape. Kids today are growing up in a world where social validation happens through likes and comments, where identity can be shaped by online communities, and where the pressure to present a perfect life online can create stress most older generations never had to think about. Daniel, let me bring you in here. When you step back and look at the bigger cultural shifts, technology, education systems, social media, even the way institutions talk about identity and vulnerability, do you think those systems are shaping a generation that's less resilient, or are we simply witnessing a society redefining what strength and resilience actually look like in the modern world?
I think what we're really seeing is a massive cultural shift that happened very quickly, and societies don't always adjust smoothly when that kind of change occurs. Over the last 20 years, institutions, schools, corporations, media platforms, even entertainment, began placing a much larger emphasis on emotional safety, identity, and social validation. Again, a lot of that came from good intentions, but when an entire culture starts prioritizing protection over challenge, it inevitably changes how people develop resilience. Historically, resilience has almost always been built through friction, competition, criticism, failure, and learning how to recover from those things. But what makes today's environment unique is the digital ecosystem layered on top of all of it. Social media platforms reward emotional reactions, identity signaling, and social approval in ways that previous generations never experienced. Younger people are constantly navigating an online environment where reputation, belonging, and social status can shift overnight, depending on what trends, opinions, or narratives are circulating at the moment. That kind of pressure can create anxiety because it means social dynamics aren't just happening in school or among friends anymore. They're happening on a global stage where thousands or millions of people can weigh in instantly. So when people talk about fragility, I think they're partly observing the effects of this environment. But it's not necessarily that younger generations are inherently weaker. It's that they're developing inside systems that manage risk, conflict, and emotional discomfort differently than previous generations did. When the culture around you constantly tries to eliminate friction, the opportunities to build resilience become less obvious. The challenge going forward may be finding a balance between supporting people's well-being and allowing enough real-world difficulty for them to develop the strength that comes from overcoming it.
Daniel, that idea of friction building resilience is interesting because when you look back through history, almost every generation developed toughness through the challenges they faced, whether it was economic hardship, demanding jobs, competition in school or sports, or simply having to figure things out without a safety net. Those experiences forced people to adapt. Struggle wasn't always pleasant, but it often produced confidence and independence because people learned they could get through difficult situations. At the same time, though, we have to recognize that today's younger generations aren't growing up in the same environment their parents did. The pressures they face may look different, but they're still real. The cost of living is higher, the competition for jobs and education is intense, and social media has added a constant layer of public judgment that previous generations didn't deal with. A mistake that once would have been forgotten by next week can now follow someone around online for years. So the question becomes whether society has actually made young people more fragile, or whether we're looking at a generation that's navigating challenges that simply didn't exist before. Skylar, let me bring you in here. You often push back on the idea that younger generations are somehow weaker than the ones before them. When you look at the pressures young people face today, economic uncertainty, social media scrutiny, academic expectations, and a rapidly changing job market, do you think the fragile generation label misses the bigger picture? Or do you think there are cultural changes happening that really are affecting how resilience develops in younger Americans today?
I do think the fragile generation label misses a lot of the bigger picture. When people compare younger generations to the past, they often focus on how kids used to have more independence or how society expected people to tough things out. But what sometimes gets overlooked is that The world young people are stepping into today is significantly more complex and competitive than it was a few decades ago. The pressure to succeed academically, the cost of education, the housing market, and the job market are all factors that shape how people experience adulthood. When young people are constantly hearing that they have to build perfect resumes, maintain strong online identities, and compete in an economy that feels uncertain, that creates a different kind of stress than previous generations experienced. Social media also plays a huge role in how younger people develop socially. Older generations were able to make mistakes and grow from them mostly in private. Today, a mistake, an awkward moment, or a bad decision can become public very quickly. That creates an environment where young people feel like they're constantly being judged or evaluated by others. It's not surprising that mental health and anxiety conversations have become more common when people are growing up under that kind of spotlight. So when I hear the phrase fragile generation, I think it oversimplifies what's actually happening. Uh, Younger people today are navigating a world that is more connected, more competitive, and more publicly scrutinized than the one their parents experienced. The real conversation probably shouldn't be about whether they're fragile, but about how society can help them develop confidence and resilience while still acknowledging the unique pressures they're dealing with.
Skylar, I think what you're saying highlights why this conversation is more complicated than just labeling an entire generation one way or another. It's easy for people to look at younger generations through the lens of their own experiences and say things like, we had it harder, or kids today have it easier, but every era creates its own kind of pressure. The environment people grow up in shapes how they develop resilience, confidence, and independence. And right now, that environment includes things like social media scrutiny, rapid technological change, and an economy that often feels unpredictable. At the same time, though, I think there's still something valuable in the idea that struggle plays an important role in personal growth. Almost everyone can point to moments in their life where things didn't go according to plan, failure, criticism, disappointment, and those experiences ended up being the ones that helped them develop strength and perspective. If society becomes too focused on removing every obstacle or shielding people from every uncomfortable experience, there's a risk that we accidentally make the transition into adulthood harder instead of easier. So maybe the real takeaway here isn't that younger generations are fragile or tougher than the ones before them. Maybe it's that every generation has to learn resilience in the environment it grows up in. The tools may be different, the pressures may be different, but the process of learning how to handle adversity is something every generation has to figure out in its own way. And the bigger question for society moving forward might not be whether we're raising a fragile generation, but whether we're giving young people the right balance of support, responsibility, and real world experience to help them become confident adults. And that's a conversation that's probably going to keep evolving for a long time. We'll take a quick pause, and when we come back, we'll wrap things up with some final thoughts.
Before we wrap up today's episode, if you enjoy the conversations we're having here on Data and Dissonance, one of the best ways you can support the show is by checking out the Data and Dissonance merch shop. We've got a growing lineup of gear designed for people who enjoy independent thinking and a little humor mixed with their politics and culture commentary. That includes hoodies, hats, mugs, tote bags, and a whole collection of bumper stickers that tend to spark some interesting conversations wherever they show up. Some of the fan favorites right now include Make Orwell Fiction Again, Keep Your Feelings Off My Freedoms, and My Coffee is Dark, My Humor is Darker, My Taxes Are Too High. And speaking of coffee, don't forget about the Data and Dissonance coffee blends. You can grab High Lakes Light Roast, Rock Creek Medium Roast, or Bitter Root French Roast, all roasted in the USA and available in either whole bean or ground. So if you want to support the show and represent the Data and Dissonance community out in the world, head over to the merch store and check it out.
Tonight's conversation reminds me of something that happens in almost every generation. At some point, people begin comparing the present to the past, usually with a little nostalgia mixed in. Older generations remember the struggles they faced growing up and the lessons those struggles taught them, and it's easy to look at younger people and wonder whether they're developing that same kind of resilience. But the reality is, every generation grows up in a world shaped by its own challenges. 20 or 30 years ago, the pressures people faced looked very different. The internet was still young, social media didn't dominate daily life, and the pace of cultural change moved slower. Today's young people are growing up in an environment where the entire world is connected through a screen. Success, failure, friendships, and mistakes can all play out in front of an audience that didn't exist for previous generations. That kind of environment changes how people experience pressure, criticism, and identity in ways we're still learning to understand. At the same time, there's still a timeless truth that applies across every generation. Resilience usually comes from experience. Confidence is often built through overcoming difficulty. Learning how to navigate setbacks, criticism, and uncertainty is part of becoming a capable adult. And while society should absolutely care about the well-being of younger generations, it's also important that people develop the strength and independence that comes from facing real challenges. So maybe the real question isn't whether we're raising a fragile generation. Maybe the real question is whether we're helping younger people develop the tools they'll need to navigate a rapidly changing world, the ability to think critically, adapt to challenges, build meaningful relationships, and stay grounded in who they are, even when the world around them moves fast. Because every generation eventually becomes the one responsible for guiding the next. And the goal shouldn't be raising perfect people, but the goal should be raising capable ones. Thanks for spending part of your day with us. This has been Data and Dissonance, and as always, remember to speak truth, stir thought.
Today's episode of Data and Dissonance is brought to you by the Caleb Rourke Thriller series, written by our host, Artie. If you enjoy the themes we explore here on the show, questions about power, truth, hidden agendas, and the forces shaping the modern world, you'll find those same ideas woven throughout the Caleb Rourke story. The series begins with The Covenant Protocol, a high-stakes thriller that pulls readers into a world of covert operations, political intrigue, and a dangerous secret that powerful people will do anything to keep buried. The story continues in The Prophet Directive, where the stakes grow even higher and the battle over truth, control, and global influence becomes even more intense. And the latest installment in the series, Black Echo Rising, continues to expand the world of Caleb Rourke as the consequences of those hidden forces begin to surface. And beyond the books, the Data and Dissonance creative universe also includes music created by Artie as well. If you haven't checked it out yet, you can find the album Uncaged, a grunge-influenced record inspired by the struggles, battles, and personal experiences that shaped his life. That album explores themes of overcoming hardship, confronting personal demons, and finding strength through adversity. There's also the country album Four Wheelers and Hallelujah, which blends storytelling, faith, family, and small-town American life into a collection of songs that reflect a more roots-driven sound. You can find the Caleb Rourke Thriller series on Amazon and stream the albums Uncaged and Four Wheelers and Hallelujah on Spotify and other major music platforms.